The Resilient Surgical Leader, a podcast with Ken Lipshy and Dr. Paul Carlton, Jr., November of 2023. In October of 2023, at the Excelsior Surgical Society meeting, Dr. Paul Carlton discussed with us his experience on 9/11 at Ground Zero as a first responder. During this discussion, Paul discussed key points for resiliency of a surgical leader, including lessons learned during disaster preparedness planning, lessons learned from disasters, and leading up the chain of command. How to affect change that relies on leaders above you who may not understand or may be unwilling to make critical changes. And a reminder that change implies risk taking. In the days prior to Veterans Day 2023, I asked Dr. Carlton to relate to us these lessons that he discussed briefly during the Excelsior Surgical Society meeting. Dr. Carlton, if you could just introduce yourself to us, then we would learn much from your leadership skills from your past experiences.
I am Paul K. Carlton, Jr., retired Air Force Surgeon General, General Surgeon by background, and 37-year Air Force veteran. I've had the privilege to challenge the medical leadership on multiple occasions. Today, I'd like to go through a series of slide decks that hopefully will help all of our new surgeons learn how to deal with adversity and dealing with difficult people. Okay, are you set?
This is perfect. Yes, thank you so much for doing this.
Okay, then we're set. Again, the whole discussion includes lessons learned during disaster preparedness and planning, lessons learned from disasters, leading up the chain of command, how to affect change that relies on leaders above you who don't understand or are unwilling to make critical changes. And remember, change implies risk, which is an uncommon leadership trait in our current society. Now, my history, I'm the son of an Air Force leader. I grew up around a historical leadership. I heard many stories of leadership in action. I attended the Air Force Academy with the goal of being a pilot. I flunked the physical for pilots, so went to medical school instead. In a surgical residency, took care of many of our historical leaders. The Marine Barracks incident in October 1983, I was convinced was a lousy war plan. I offered suggestions on how to improve that, was laughed at for suggesting that a lieutenant colonel could impact the war plan. I stayed around at that point and decided to make those changes that enabled the diet of wounds rate to go from 24% to 9%, resulting in over 12,000 extra alive as a result of those changes. I led the Pentagon rescue on 911. I don't just talk the talk, I walk the walk. I lead by example. I led the rescue team that went into this carnage in the Pentagon on 911, penetrated that hole into the Navy Communication Center and led the rescue of 3 individuals who were gone, but we were able to revive and pull out of that inferno. Obviously, I didn't stay for the long term. I'm out briefing the team taking over responsibility for the 911 scenario. As you can see, passing the lead to another Air Force individual and his enlisted colleague. So I'm also an 11,000 case general surgeon. Now, then my own history, COVID-19 taught me an awful lot how to deal with large organizations and the difficulties therein. Now, from the line perspective, my dad, a full general, P.K. Carlton, retired as a commander of MAC, had many of the same issues. He was a line heretic in the finest sense. He was passed over for promotion in World War II for requesting combat duty in the B-29 as a lieutenant. His commander said he shouldn't be promoted then to captain because I needed him to train people in the training environment. He told Curtis LeMay that he had lousy tactics after losing 12 of 15 in formation over Tokyo 1945. He developed the takeoff and landing data card at Roswell Air Force Base, or Roswell, New Mexico, when it was apparent that different times, different temperatures, and different altimeter settings resulted in degraded performance at altitude, and developed a system that is currently used today to govern our takeoff and landings in the commercial airline fleet. He did not like the B-29 one-way missions to Russia. from Roswell in 1946 to 50. So developed the SAC war plan that is still in effect today. He then was an aide to Curtis LeMay from 49 to 1953. There was an episode when they took off out of Washington, D.C. The gear wouldn't come up on a new airplane, a so-called C-97. LeMay turned around and on short final was getting prepared to land when Dad advanced the throttles and said, "Sir, we don't want to do that." He started to go around and LeMay said, "Why not?" And my father said, because on page 243 of the tech data, it says that if you don't have landing gear jacks, then you can't correct the landing gear problem. And the only landing gear jacks are back in Omaha, where we're going, or in Seattle, Washington. LeMay said, "Well, it'll slow us down. We don't have the gas to give it." Dad said on page 50 of the tech data, it says we only lose 10 knots with this. That puts us having 2 hours to spare over Omaha. They landed successfully back in Omaha, Nebraska, expecting to be fired. General LeMay looked at my dad after the shutdown and said, "I hate to be corrected by a major." My dad thought that was the end of his career. And so LeMay said, "So come in tomorrow as a lieutenant colonel. I hate to be corrected by a major." So he was a line heretic in a different time. He ran an accident investigation that revealed a yellow parachute as directly responsible for a B-52 crash. Then did the homework to show that a yellow parachute degraded over time from a white parachute, and it was primarily an issue of logistics and not pilot error. When he was the commander of the large airplane group called Military Airlift Command, and a C-5 was potentially hijacked, he let out the discussion, "There better be blood on the ramp if a Mac airplane is hijacked." That ended the hijacking discussion. After the Nickel Grass operation, the Israeli airlift, 1973, he said, "We've got to have a wide body tanker to correct the problems we had in this exercise." Took 3 years, but it sold the KC-10 of today. He said all airlift needs to come under one specified command, completed that in February of 77, and MAC became a specified command instead of a unified command. Now, my crises, obviously flunking a physical for pilot training was very demoralizing to me, but I realized that and went into medical school, did a residency at 120 hours a week for 5 years, went through the Beirut bombing episode in Lebanon, 1983, was actually fired for that activity because I refused to back down on a civilian who had a stroke at that time. I was unhappy with AirVac in the Gulf War of 1991. They were stuck in the Vietnam War. I suggested that AirVac needed to be a better partner and be able to do critical care in the air. That did not sit well with leadership. The Surgeon General actually told me, "That's like trying to catheterize a running racehorse. We need to stop that immediately and don't ever bring this up again." Now, because we changed in Gulf War I, we had 30,000 medics deployed. In the War on Terror, we never had more than 1,000 because all we did was stabilize people, and Air Force did its proper job of moving patients to higher levels of care. I was fired directly in Gulf War I for combining with an Army unit. That was turned around after I came back from overseas. I had court-martial action started 3 different times for standing up for things I thought was important. Gulf War I for combining with an Army, and a Haiti op for saying that I would not abide by leaving someone who had salvageable surgical illness for failure of particular data that was required by the State Department, and a 911 because court-martial action was preferred because I had not checked with the Secretary of Defense, who was hiding in the basement when we made decisions to go and help New York City. So I've been down that road difficulty. I was fired 5 times, each time reversed in the light of day. So the difficulties in challenging authority, I have lived through very completely. COVID-19 was very clear to me was an airborne respiratory illness because SARS and MERS were airborne respiratory illnesses, and they were first cousins of COVID-19. Unfortunately, it took 1.2 million dead Americans and 27 months to concur with that discussion. Now, the lessons learned, most guidelines in our military are written in blood. When the world changes, those important guidelines may no longer apply. Learning to think critically with all the information available is the most important part of wartime thinking. Remember, everything will be hashed out for years after any crisis with a magnifying glass. So all decisions must be made in the light of discovery. Now, my basic discussion and thoughts on life are nothing can take the place of persistence. Talent will not. Nothing is more common than unsuccessful men with talent. Genius will not. Unrewarded genius is almost a proverb. Education will not. The world is full of educated derelicts. Persistence and determination alone are omnipotent. Now, those things that are written in blood, if you look carefully, how do you affect change? Obviously, you must be a recognized expert. You have to have the right combination of experience and wisdom tempered by time. You have to understand how to bring about institutional change. Understand that you must go through an apprenticeship. You must be qualified as a journeyman in whatever endeavor that has to be. And frequently, it requires being a supervisor to affect change. Now, residency allows a progression in decision-making over many years. The Air Force Academy is an artificial environment because in 4 years, you progress to command and control. In the Air Force as a whole, it takes 30 to 40 years of good decision-making to be in a decision-making role. In life, it's also true. Rarely do you see a CEO of a major corporation at age 21. Now, learners, I take this to heart. In times of change, the learners will inherit the world, while the learned will find themselves beautifully equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists. And I think right now our world is full of learned individuals. Now, to address those, you have to understand where people come from. We all live in three minds, the political, the rational, the emotional. You've got to understand their interplay. Each person addresses these in various proportion. Rarely are they in balance. The political world is real, and how it appears to people becomes extremely important. The rational world is where most surgeons live because they're faced with data and have to make decisions very quickly. The emotional world is where many non-surgeons live because they get emotionally tied and cannot make reasonable decisions. So the reality is you must balance all three of these if you are to affect change: the political, the rational, and the emotional. Now, another way to say that is, when do you press on, when do you hold, or when do you fold? And the art of change is knowing which of those three to do at any given time. Now, my opinion is crisis leadership is a contact sport. Courage, physical bravery is found more often than the spiritual variety. Moral courage is rare, and crisis leadership takes courage. Now, this particular brief comes from a talk given by the Strategic Court Lake Spring meeting by the Secretary of Defense. Advocacy puts more than just the individual officer at risk. It's the family as well as those within the organization who are looking to that person for leadership and mentorship, who will likely suffer if a penalty is to be paid. Again, it's naive to believe the system necessarily protects innovators or intellectual iconoclasts. Being right is no insurance either. In the real world, happy endings are not guaranteed. Secretary Gates at this same discussion continues, one day you'll take a fork in the road. You go one way, you can be somebody. You will have to make compromises and you will have to turn your back on your friends. But we'll be a member of the club that will get you promoted and give good assignments. Or you can go the other way and do something for your country and your Air Force. If you decide to do something, you may not get promoted, you may not get good assignments, and you certainly will not be a favorite of your superiors. But you won't have to compromise yourself. To be somebody or to do something in life, there's often a roll call. That's when you have to make a decision to be or to do. Now, this statement by the Secretary of Defense is an indictment upon every one of the general officers in the Air Force. It's a damning indictment that ought to trouble all officers. In truth, it's a call to action. We've got to teach our officers to be loyal, innovative thinker. Teach them how to appeal, how to come up with new solutions to the vexing problems of today. Now, that's what this talk is all about. How to dissent, be loyal to the organization, and be loyal to the truth that you see. I call that being a heretic. And we've got to teach our future senior leaders how to dissent. Now, change is very hard. The one position that cannot be taken from any individual is their integrity. It can only be given away. Now, why is change so hard? Well, of the positives, the neutrals, and the negatives, the reality is that there's only two positives, and that is excitement or pleasure or joy. There is one neutral, which is startle, and there are 6 negatives: anger, fear, shame, distress, disgust, and dismell. Now, my personal journey, I'll cover in some examples of dissent. Again, we'll go through some others as we go through it. How do we get where we are in combat casualty care? No one would resist trying to improve the survival of our wounded. Everybody is on board with trying to do that. But remember, the integrity can only be given away, and you've got to deal with these 1 neutral, 2 positives, and 6 negative to change. And it's because our brains are hardwired to resist change. Again, this joke, I think, summarizes it very well. I'm far too busy to see any stupid salesman. Can't you see I've got a battle to fight? To a knight armed with a sword and a bow and arrow environment, and somebody standing there with a Gatling gun offering him help. Now, the reality is that's what Custer did in 1876. When he left Fort Laramie, he left 6 Gatling guns because nobody needed those newfangled things as he headed out to his fateful battle at the Little Bighorn. So leadership imperatives, I believe these are the imperatives: core value, attitude, competence, mentorship, and self-protection. And understand it takes thick skins as you begin any of this effort. Don't expect to be patted on the back or be told what a good job you're doing. Our press is not like that. All of us will be criticized. It is part of our culture, and it's not new to have such. If you look carefully at this quote given in the Generalist and Journalist quote of the New York Times, 14 March 07, it appears we've appointed our worst generals to command forces and our most gifted and brilliant to edit newspapers. In fact, I discovered by reading newspapers that these journalist geniuses plainly saw my strategic defects from the start, yet failed to inform me until it was too late. Accordingly, I'm readily willing to yield my command to those who obviously have a superior intellect, and I in turn will do my best for the cause by writing editorials after the fact. That's General Robert E. Lee, who'd had a tough time in July of 1863. So criticism is not new. You don't accept your dog's admiration as conclusive evidence that you are wonderful. So principles for change. You never question motivation. They see the world differently. They're not wrong. You've got to sell your points, and you've got to be a recognized expert. The key statement is that those that disagree aren't wrong. They see the world differently. They cannot envision a different reality. Now, in our medical world, this is so true. The surgeon takes every complication personally, every death is personal. Our other colleagues do not have that same inherent look at how we might do better. Again, the principles of change. My focus in the rational mind is also called blunt. Mine was to improve survival of the war wounded. No other agenda, no credit needed in that balance of political, rational, and emotional. Now, nomenclature is important. Dying is a process that can be interrupted up to a certain point. We're still defining what that point is. There was a conscious decision to go after the killed in action group. We would move surgical care far forward. We would do salvage surgery. We'd build teamwork over time and space and standardized training. Critical care in the air enabled us to get injured members home with family to the tune of 13,000 people who have been moved on ventilators in this most recent war that has enabled us to focus our full efforts on survival and not supporting 30,000 deployed medics. That's why we've only had 1,000 deployed in this current war. Now, an overview, again, what is heresy? How do you appeal? And what are the imperatives? Again, a heretic defined is someone who sees a truth that contradicts conventional wisdom of an organization, yet remains loyal to that truth and at the same time loyal to the organization. Now, heretics won't shut up, and it's not because they're being difficult, but because they see a truth that is difficult to deal with in light of current wisdom. And so, how do you then keep a heretic alive? Well, that's called appeal. Everyone needs to understand the chains of authority, when to appeal, when to take a stand, and in 7 steps to keep you safe. Now, the chain of command, understand the wiring diagram that explains who's in charge. Learn it, know it, understand it, and use it. The chain of influence extends beyond the chain of command. It affects assignments, working conditions, promotions, etc. You have to understand the basic reason that authority exists. What are the basic functions? Punish those who do evil, praise those who do well. We need to be under it for character training, for conscience sake, for credibility and influence. And when do you appeal? When they fail in their duty, when they go beyond their duty, when they ask you to do wrong, unethical, immoral, or illegal, when damage to life or property might occur. Now, this is where our world on the surgical side is so critical. Damage to life becomes an important part of this. Now, how do you appeal? You've got to check your own attitude. You've got to have the spirit of a learner and a servant and be humble. You've got to do your homework and find out why you disagree. 99% of the problems will be yours, not your boss's. You've got to have a creative alternative. First, discover what the basic discussion is of the one giving the command being the appeal. Now, different views of work are healthy. Different levels of understanding are the basis of most disagreements. And you've got to have a creative alternative. Don't complain without offering a solution to the problem. Ensure all details are addressed. Prepare to follow quickly through on all proposed alternatives. Now, I've lived in a world where complaints without solutions is equal to whining, and whining is something that we should never be involved doing. Now, contacting the proper authority, you've got to talk to the person in charge who can make decisions. You have to inform your boss of your intent to appeal. Invite him or her to your appeal. That will almost always reverse most things that are done that aren't done on a rational basis. You've got to establish your position under his or her jurisdiction. It is their problem. You've got to identify the cause of your appeal. Is it political? Is it rational? Is it emotional? Is it you? Is it your appeal? Is it your authority? You got to hold up your mirror and look critically at yourself. Now, when criticized, look for the issue. Don't take it personally. There's a grain of truth in everything that's said. Now, then trace the criticism to its real source. Is it another agenda? Is it a reaction to me or what's been said? And know that you are under your proper umbrella of authority. Respond wisely to your critics. Now, look at fear as an invitation to defeat. Make a conscious effort to improve with critique, each critique. Understand that you're leading as you should. You will be subject to frequent criticism. No controversy, no progress. Be ready to stand alone for the right decisions when they're appropriate. Integrity is the key. Understand we all see the world differently. This is a quote from my politically appointed boss, Assistant Secretary of Defense Health Affairs in 2000. Dr. Carlton, thank God for bureaucracies. We will prevent you from endangering our patients with these idiotic ideas. We will out-bureaucrat you, says this English measure who has functioned in the Washington environment for 20 years. Now, the net result of those idiotic replies are shown nicely by Holcomb et al. In the KIA group that died of wounds rate. The combined case fatality rate has given us the best survival in the history of war. So the 7 steps of action for appeal: check your attitude, yours and your boss's. Clear your conscience. Make the appeal because it's right to do. Discern basic intentions. Know your boss's basis for a decision. Design creative alternatives. Appealing without solutions is whining. Appeal to your authority. Explain how it will reach the goal. Leave the final decision up to that authority. Be patient. Let that authority mull it over. Forcing a quick decision almost always results in a no. be ready to stand alone, understand our Air Force ideals of integrity, service, and excellence are difficult to live in a daily world. Now, some examples in my life, taking the Flying Ambulance Surgical Team, which was established in 1983, to expeditionary medical support took 16 years. Medical Center Without Walls is still not done. TRICARE fixes I proposed in 95 are still not complete. The Career Option Matrix, taking enlisted nurses, is still not done, although it's closer than it was before. Critical Care in the Air took 15 years for implementation since I started doing that in October of 1983. The Readiness Skills Verification Program, again, took 15 years to validate when someone is ready to go to war or ready to do some other deployed activity. Far Forward Surgery took 20 years to implement. Recommended in 1983. We didn't get it done until 2003. Salvage surgeries took the same time. People were focused entirely on doing what they'd been taught to do in the 40s and 50s instead of recognizing that we needed to cut the time that we exposed people and we brought them into a referral facility with a core temperature of 89 to 90 degrees, when if we simply did salvage surgery, we could bring them in properly, warm and fully resuscitated. Better protection for our healthcare workers is still a work in progress. Again, the timing is critical. The time in years, you're talking normally, it takes some 15 to 20 years to become, affect the change that you honestly believe in. Now, for this attitude of a heretic, I was fired 5 times, formally disciplined 3 times under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, was denied promotion until I apologized for a Senate staffer's illegal action. Now, was it worth it? Well, yes, absolutely. The best survival in the history of war is worth every unpleasantness. Now we need the same attitude to properly improve our Air Force. Just raising the issue is always very, very painful. Again, breaking barriers is hard. Every new barrier takes perseverance and determination to overcome. We accept now that picture of someone going through the sound barrier, but the reality was it took until 1947 to get that done. Now, that was 44 years after the Wright brothers had first flown. It takes a culture of constant, intelligent inquiry. Now, you've shortened a bit, Ken, but that's the fundamental discussion that you put together and modified for me. Clearly, I think that's what we're mostly looking for, is how do you establish that culture of constant, intelligent inquiry?
Do you have anything else to say?
No.
I'm virtually speechless. I mean, so, I've broken several of these rules in my life as a leader, and I understand by what I'm seeing here, I'm understanding how, in the context of things, my decision and how I try to come about making changes in certain instances was truly not the best way to do it. I think that this is a very quick, in a nutshell, method to pass on to other people who really want to learn. It's an art. I mean, you've developed an art. You have created a sculpture that really makes sense. You've taken what for most of us is just this amorphous piece of clay that we just don't understand, and we mess around with it. We try to do stuff and we make a mistake. We have to start over. You have created truly a sculpture of what it takes to get through almost any type of world and environment as a leader. I really think that I can, shift this over into a YouTube video and easily drop this onto the American College of Surgeons military communities. I think there's a lot of people on there that would love to hear this unless they've already heard this before.
Well, Ken, that'd be great. That if you recall at that meeting in Boston, one of the questions I was asked was, how do you affect change? I said, well, you got to be a pain in the rear end, but the reality is you have to stick around to get changes made. Every one of these took decades, 10, 15 years on almost all of them. And every one of them is something that surgeons have to deal with every day.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the thought process, and I've said this before, that I'm willing to follow my sword for what's right. And what I'm hearing here is that's what sometimes people would like you to do. And you know, you need to stop short of that and rethink. You've taught me a lot. I'm telling you, I've learned a lot from this, and I've rethought a lot.
You tell me how I can help anybody, or just share this, and that's just fine. Well, I would agree with that. Now, when I'm doing it in front of an audience, I tell more stories, the reality of each of the firings. So it goes out to about 50 minutes. The more important brief I've given recently, Ken, is what have we learned from the lessons of COVID?
Yeah, I read that. I saw that.
Yes, as a warfighter's mentality. And the answer was, I got 12 different groups to accept that air is a threat. And they had the worst performance we had was a 90% reduction in the COVID transmission rate in hospitals. 90%.
Yeah,
That's more topical, but this is a historical piece.
well, it's definitely. I looked at that, and that may actually be something of more interest of how you can, in fact, avert continued disasters, because people continue wanting to do the same thing that is proven to be wrong, but they can't see it, and they want to keep persisting and looking at something that's an alternative that you may not agree with, but at least understanding it and using it, and it worked. So, but well, I appreciate it. I'm just almost speechless. I don't know what else to say. So I appreciate your time to do this. Thank you.
Okay, well, my pleasure, and let me know if I can help in any way.
And you answered all my questions. How do you plan for disaster? How do you respond to disasters? And, you know, how do you work with those who just really don't quite see what it is you're trying to say? And how do you still get to the point where you have a success story that saves lives? All right. Well, I don't want to take any more of your time. I appreciate it so much. Thank you.
Okay, sounds good, my friend. Take care.
You are awesome. Thank you so much. And I look forward to talking to you again in the future. You've already taught me a lot. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ken. I appreciate that. Out here.
Bye.